In the early 1980s, as the Cold War entered its most volatile and paranoid phase since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet leadership convinced itself that the West was preparing to launch a surprise nuclear strike, an attack so sudden and devastating it would wipe out the USSR's political and military command before they had any chance to respond. This fear did not come from hard intelligence or intercepted plans, but from suspicion, ideology, and a deep sense of insecurity rooted in decades of superpower rivalry. And at the center of this fear was a massive, unprecedented KGB program known as Operation Ryan. Unlike ordinary espionage missions aimed at stealing military secrets or political plans, Operation Ryan sought something far darker. Signs that NATO was preparing for an imminent, all-out nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. Its name came from the Russian acronym Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, meaning nuclear missile attack, and its mission was simple in theory, but catastrophic in execution. Search every corner of the Western world for any hint, any tremor, any signal that the United States was preparing to annihilate the USSR. In 1981, Yuri Andropov, then head of the KGB, declared that the Americans had developed a strategy not merely for deterrence, but for a decapitation strike, a plan to destroy Soviet leadership before it could order retaliation. Andropov, haunted by the Cuban Missile Crisis and obsessed with the idea that the USSR might be destroyed from within or without, personally ordered KGB officers stationed around the world to collect information on nuclear war indicators, no matter how mundane or subtle. And so began one of the largest intelligence operations in Soviet history, extending across every NATO country and involving hundreds of KGB officers, GRU agents, informants, and deep cover illegals. They were given lists, literal checklists of warning signs believed to indicate that a nuclear attack might be imminent. Increased blood donations in Western hospitals, unusual lights burning at the Pentagon late at night, more military officers seen entering government buildings, a rise in radio traffic, sudden changes in Western financial markets, empty streets near military installations, even American grocery stores stocking unusual amounts of canned food. Anything, no matter how small, could be interpreted as a signal of apocalypse. And because the operation was built on fear, not facts, many KGB officers, terrified of missing the sign that would doom their country, began reporting anomalies that were completely ordinary. A delayed train in West Germany, a late-night power outage in London, ambulances parked outside a hospital in Belgium. Every minor irregularity became, in the eyes of the Soviet leadership, another thread in a massive, sinister pattern. The paranoia sharpened dramatically when Ronald Reagan became president. Reagan's hardline speeches, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, were broadcast across the world, and while many in the West saw them as political theater, Andropov took them literally. To him, Reagan's words were the ideological prelude to nuclear war. Then came the deployment of the Pershing II missiles in Europe, fast, accurate, and capable of hitting Moscow in minutes. To the KGB, this looked like the opening move in a Western strategy designed to eliminate Soviet leadership before they could retaliate. Operation Ryan intensified. Every embassy, every KGB residentura, every clandestine agent in the West was ordered to shift focus from long-term intelligence gathering to immediate, constant surveillance of possible attack preparations. KGB officers in London, Paris, Bonn, and Washington began sending urgent cables to Moscow, warning that Western militaries appeared to be moving toward heightened readiness, even when they weren't. Western military exercises, ordinary annual drills, were interpreted as rehearsals for war. Every NATO staff meeting seemed like a war council. Every change in diplomatic tone was interpreted as the final calm before the storm. The tragedy of Operation Ryan was that it created the very thing it feared, a feedback loop of escalating paranoia. The more the USSR searched for signs of a Western first strike, the more it found them. The more evidence Moscow believed it had, the more it convinced itself that nuclear war was not only possible, but imminent. And because Operation Ryan was one of the KGB's most secret programs, very few Soviet officials understood its full scope or its flaws. False alarms accumulated. Misinterpretations multiplied. The KGB began sending reports to the Soviet Politburo, warning that the West might attempt a surprise attack within months, then weeks, then days. Some Soviet generals seriously believed that NATO was waiting for the first snowfall of winter to launch an all-out nuclear blitz. And then, in 1983, Operation Ryan collided with a moment so dangerous it nearly triggered the Third World War. The NATO exercise Able Archer 83, a rehearsal designed to simulate a coordinated Western nuclear response. The Americans believed the exercise was routine, but to the Soviets, already trapped in the psychological grip of Operation Ryan, it looked like the real thing, a funeral disguised as a drill. As Western commanders played out the scenario, moving imaginary nuclear forces into imaginary positions, the Soviet military believed the imaginary movements were real. Missile units went on heightened alert. Strategic bombers were loaded with nuclear weapons. Submarines slipped quietly into the Arctic seas. The world, without knowing it, came closer to nuclear war than at any point since 1962. And all of it, every escalation, every alert, every moment of terror, was ultimately rooted in Operation Ryan, the KGB program built on fear rather than evidence, secrecy rather than shared, understanding, paranoia rather than rational analysis. The operation had been created to prevent a surprise nuclear attack, but its effect was the opposite. It pushed the USSR toward a hair-trigger mindset in which a misread signal, a broken radio line, or a delayed military transmission could have set off the end of the world. As Operation Ryan expanded throughout 1982 and 1983, it began consuming the entire Soviet intelligence community, reshaping the priorities of KGB residenturas across the world, and transforming routine political events into indicators of doomsday. What made the program uniquely dangerous was not just its enormous scale, but the psychological environment in which it was born. An environment in which the Soviet Union felt cornered, deteriorating, and increasingly outpaced by the West. The Soviet economy was stagnating, technological gaps were widening, and the Kremlin's aging leadership saw danger everywhere. Yuri Andropov, now elevated from KGB chairman to general secretary, was the embodiment of this paranoia. Thin, pale, and chronically ill, Andropov viewed the United States through the distorted lens of ideological warfare, believing that capitalism's ultimate strategy was to eliminate socialism through nuclear decapitation. To him, Reagan's talk of peace through strength sounded like the rhetoric of a man preparing for war through annihilation. And so, the KGB's global network, spanning embassies, illegal agents, wiretaps, informants, and surveillance posts, was reoriented almost entirely toward detecting the invisible countdown to nuclear Armageddon. The directives sent to KGB officers abroad became more urgent and more absurd with each passing month. Officers in West Germany were told to monitor NATO airfields at dawn to see if pilots showed signs of unusual tension. Agents in Paris were ordered to count how many lights stayed on in the French Ministry of Defense after 9 p.m. In Washington, the KGB Residentura began monitoring the parking lot of the Pentagon, believing that an increase in parked cars could signal last-minute war planning. Agents were told to watch corporate executives, television anchors, and even movie studios for subtle, behavioral changes that might precede a nuclear strike. The list of indicators grew so bizarre that even seasoned KGB officers privately questioned whether Moscow had gone insane. Yet the pressure to report something, anything, was immense. Careers depended on it. Failure to identify a potential threat could be interpreted as negligence, or worse, betrayal. Many agents, terrified of being blamed for missing the critical warning sign, began flooding Moscow with reports filled with vague observations, unverified claims, and amateur interpretations. The result was an intelligence disaster, a mountain of useless data that Moscow treated as gospel. This cycle of paranoia escalated dramatically in late 1983 when a series of unrelated incidents collided to create the most dangerous nuclear atmosphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Earlier that year, the Soviets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it accidentally entered Soviet airspace, killing 269 civilians, including a U.S. congressman. The international backlash was enormous, and the Kremlin became convinced that the United States would use the tragedy as a pretext for war. At the same time, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, convincing Soviet leaders that America was developing a missile shield to make a first strike survivable. Meanwhile, NATO began preparing for Able Archer 83, its annual command post exercise. On paper, Able Archer was a routine rehearsal simulating procedures for nuclear escalation. But that year, NATO added new, more realistic elements: encrypted communications, higher-level participation, and simulated movement of nuclear forces. To Western officers, these changes were meant to improve readiness. To Soviet intelligence officers steeped in Operation Ryan, they were unmistakable signs that NATO was preparing to launch a real attack disguised as an exercise. And so, when Able Archer commenced in November 1983, Operation Ryan collided with geopolitical reality. KGB stations across Europe sent urgent reports to Moscow warning that NATO appeared to be shifting into actual war readiness. When Ryan officers observed that Western communications had gone silent, a normal aspect of the exercise, they interpreted it as the final step before launching nuclear missiles. When NATO simulated the release of nuclear weapons, Soviet analysts misinterpreted the simulation as real-world preparation. Alarms were triggered. Soviet strategic bombers were placed on alert in East Germany and Poland. Missile units increased readiness. Some Soviet submarines moved into firing positions. The Warsaw Pact stood one misinterpreted signal away from initiating a preemptive nuclear strike. Yet the most disturbing part was that the Kremlin did not fully trust its own intelligence system. Years of paranoia had eroded rational judgment. Andropov's health had deteriorated dramatically, making him prone to emotional interpretation rather than analytical thinking. The collective leadership that surrounded him, old, cautious, and paranoid, chose to assume the worst-case scenario rather than risk being caught unprepared. Inside NATO command centers, no one had the slightest idea how close the Soviets were to the brink. Western officers viewed Able Archer as just another exercise, unaware that the KGB interpreted it as the beginning of World War III. This misalignment, two superpowers acting on two completely different realities, created the most dangerous form of instability a nuclear world can experience. One side rehearsing for war, the other preparing to counter a war that wasn't actually happening. And then, in the middle of this crisis, something remarkable happened. A single man, KGB double agent Oleg Gordievsky, realized what was unfolding. Gordievsky, stationed at the KGB Residentura in London, had a broader perspective than many of his colleagues. While others saw Abel Archer as proof of Western aggression, he recognized that NATO's behavior was unchanged from previous years. He saw no signs of panic, no unusual mobilization, no hidden war preparations in British government circles. The West was not preparing to attack, but the Kremlin believed that it was. Gordievsky realized that the USSR was on the verge of launching a preemptive strike out of mistaken fear. And so, at immense personal risk, he passed a warning to MI6. The Soviet Union was preparing for nuclear war because it thought the West had already begun the countdown. This single piece of intelligence, sent quietly, discreetly, and urgently, was relayed to Washington. It reached President Reagan, who was shocked. Reagan had never considered that the USSR genuinely believed the US might attack. To him, American strength was a deterrent, not a threat. But as he absorbed the intelligence report, he began to question whether his rhetoric and military posture were inadvertently pushing the Soviet Union toward catastrophe. This moment fundamentally changed Reagan's approach to the Cold War. It set the stage for de-escalation, diplomacy, and ultimately the negotiations that helped end the nuclear arms race. But in the closing months of 1983, as Abel Archer rolled on and Operation Ryan continued generating false alarms, the world remained balanced on a knife's edge. The slightest miscalculation, a misread radar signal, a mistyped message, a nervous officer making an assumption, could have triggered a nuclear apocalypse. And through all of it, most people on Earth had no idea how close the superpowers came to ending civilization. They went to work, watched TV, ate dinner, unaware that their fate might have been decided by a misunderstanding rooted in a deeply flawed intelligence operation. Meanwhile, inside Soviet intelligence headquarters, Operation Ryan continued expanding. New directives demanded even more detailed reporting. Moscow wanted hourly updates, not daily ones. It demanded near-constant surveillance of NATO installations. It wanted agents to monitor everything from the mood of political leaders to the pace of military bus traffic. The more the Soviet Union feared nuclear war, the more aggressively it searched for clues confirming that fear. And because Operation Ryan was built on the assumption that a surprise attack was coming, it interpreted every piece of information, from the mundane to the extraordinary, as evidence supporting its conclusion. The operation was no longer about gathering intelligence. It had become an ideological engine, transforming the ordinary rhythms of Western life into an imagined blueprint for nuclear annihilation. It was this environment, one of fear, confusion, and relentless misinterpretation, that set the stage for the most dangerous moment of 1983, when Soviet early warning satellites briefly detected what appeared to be a U.S. missile launch. And in the darkness of a control bunker near Moscow, a single Soviet officer faced a decision that could either end the world or save it. The tension created by Operation Ryan reached a terrifying climax on the night of September 26, 1983, inside a dim, windowless bunker south of Moscow, where Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, an unassuming officer in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, sat before a wall of monitors designed to provide the earliest possible warning of a U.S. nuclear strike. Petrov's job was brutally simple. If the system detected American missiles in flight, he was to report the alert up the chain of command, triggering the Soviet nuclear response system and almost certainly the end of civilization. But that night, the computer suddenly screamed a single, dreadful message. Launch detected. According to the satellite early warning system, an American intercontinental ballistic missile had just lifted off from a silo in the United States, arcing toward the Soviet Union. Sirens blared, red lights flashed. Petrov froze, staring at the screen in disbelief. The protocol was absolute. If the Americans had launched, the USSR had mere minutes to retaliate before its own weapons were destroyed in their silos. One missile could be an error, but moments later, the system reported another missile, then another, and another, and another. 5 nuclear missiles appeared to be inbound from the United States, each capable of vaporizing millions. Petrov's officers looked to him, their faces pale. The Soviet leadership, conditioned by Operation Ryan to expect a surprise American strike, would almost certainly interpret this detection as the beginning of World War III. Reporting the alert could trigger an immediate order to launch Soviet missiles in retaliation. And yet Petrov hesitated. Something didn't feel right. His training told him that a U.S. first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. He knew the U.S. strategy was based on overwhelming force, not symbolic gestures. And he knew that the Soviet early warning system, newly deployed and not fully tested, was flawed. But most dangerously of all, Petrov knew that the Kremlin, paralyzed by fear, consumed by Operation Ryan, and convinced that Reagan was preparing to attack, might not question the alert before responding. In that bunker, under pressure so intense it could break a person's sanity, Stanislav Petrov made a decision that defied everything his orders demanded. He declared the alert a false alarm. He did so with nothing more than instinct, logic, and a refusal to let fear dictate his judgment. Minutes passed. No explosions came. The Soviet Union was safe. Petrov had saved the world, unknowingly preventing what could have been a retaliatory strike that would annihilate billions. Only later would investigators discover the cause. The KGB. Satellites had misinterpreted sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds as missile launches, a rare alignment of geometry and timing that tricked the system. But inside the Kremlin, the incident was interpreted as something even more terrifying. Evidence that the United States was testing the Soviet response time before launching a real attack. Instead of calming Soviet fears, the false alarm fueled Operation Ryan even further. If Petrov had followed his orders, the world would have ended. But because he didn't, paranoid minds within the Soviet leadership asked a darker question. What if the Americans knew about the flaw in the system? What if they were probing the Soviet Union's readiness for a decapitation strike? What if a real attack was imminent? The KGB seized on the incident as justification to accelerate Operation Ryan to unprecedented levels. Stations across Europe were told to increase surveillance threefold. Agents in West Germany monitored hospitals for sudden blood donations, believing the U.S. might pre-stage medical supplies for post-strike casualties. In London, the KGB watched Parliament for signs of sudden evacuation. In the United States, agents reported on everything from Pentagon parking patterns to nighttime lighting in government buildings. Every anomaly became a potential sign of the end. And in November 1983, barely 6 weeks after Petrov's decision, NATO began conducting Able Archer 83. The exercise that Operation Ryan had long predicted would disguise a real nuclear attack. For the Soviet leadership, the combination of Petrov's false alarm, Reagan's aggressive rhetoric, and the realistic features of Able Archer formed a deadly triad of perceived threats. KGB headquarters reported that NATO was preparing for full-scale nuclear release. The Politburo interpreted Able Archer's communications blackout as war preparation. Soviet intercept intelligence showed NATO forces simulating nuclear authorization procedures, which looked to nervous Soviet analysts like the real thing. In response, the USSR took steps that even today remain stunning in their scale. Nuclear-armed bombers were placed on tarmac alert in Poland and East Germany. Missile forces in the Western USSR quietly moved to high readiness status. Mobile SS-20 launchers dispersed into forests. Submarine commanders were ordered to prepare for immediate launch orders. And the Soviet early warning network operated at maximum alert. The world had sleepwalked into its most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But unlike 1962, when political leaders at least understood that they were in a crisis, this time, only one side knew. NATO had no clue the Soviets were mobilizing. Western intelligence agencies did not detect the heightened Soviet alert until years later, after the Cold War ended. Reagan, Thatcher, and NATO commanders believed Able Archer was a routine drill. The Soviets believed it was the beginning of the apocalypse. This asymmetry, the absolute mismatch between reality and perception, is what made Operation Ryan uniquely terrifying. A nuclear war could have begun because one side thought the other side had started it. It was deterrence logic turned upside down. Inside the Kremlin, fear metastasized into certainty. The Politburo, guided by incomplete intelligence and poisoned by Operation Ryan, came to believe that the United States was capable of a surprise attack so profound that the Soviet Union might cease to exist before it could even retaliate. Some Politburo members argued that if NATO launched an attack, the USSR should preemptively strike first. Others argued that the West was too confident, too arrogant, too unpredictable, and therefore more dangerous than ever. Andropov, now dying in a hospital bed and increasingly removed from direct decision-making, still influenced the atmosphere with his long-cultivated paranoia. He had long believed that the West planned to eliminate the Soviet Union in one lightning blow, and as his health deteriorated, he became even more convinced that nuclear war was imminent. And among the Soviet military, the fear that they might miss the signs of an American attack, fear instilled by Operation Ryan, created a hair-trigger mentality that magnified every false signal into a potential catalyst for launch. Meanwhile, the ordinary citizens of both superpowers continued living their lives, unaware that the world's fate was being decided by exhausted analysts, outdated computers, and aging leaders trapped in ideological illusions. In Washington and London, no one realized that the Soviets were interpreting routine activities through the lens of nuclear paranoia. When NATO simulated the release of nuclear weapons during Able Archer, Soviet intelligence interpreted the simulation as real-world pre-launch authorization. When American bases increased communication security for the drill, Kremlin analysts assumed the Americans were preparing for war. When Western leaders failed to send diplomatic reassurances, because they didn't know the USSR was panicking, the silence was interpreted as proof that Reagan was preparing to strike. In this environment of fear, one miscommunication could have destroyed the world, and in a chilling twist of history, the crisis eventually calmed, not because of diplomacy or clarity, but because the exercise ended. Able Archer concluded on schedule. NATO returned to normal operations, and without the pressure of simulated war, Soviet analysts slowly concluded that NATO's forces were not mobilizing further. The Kremlin exhaled. The moment passed, but the scars remained. Operation Ryan had shown just how fragile nuclear stability truly was. It revealed that intelligence systems built on fear and ideology could create dangers more deadly than enemy missiles. and it exposed a truth that stunned Western leaders when they learned it years later. The USSR had nearly launched a nuclear strike because it believed the US was about to attack, even though the US had no such plan. After Able Archer, even some Soviet military officials began questioning Operation Ryan's assumptions, but the program continued regardless. Paranoia had momentum, and as long as the Soviet Union remained locked in a global confrontation with the West, the machinery of fear kept turning. As the shock of Able Archer 83 slowly receded, the Soviet Union found itself staring into a mirror reflecting its own fears back at itself. And within the Kremlin, a disturbing realization began to take shape. The USSR had nearly launched a nuclear strike not because the United States was preparing to attack, but because the Soviets had become prisoners of their own paranoia. Yet instead of winding down Operation Ryan or revising its assumptions, the Soviet leadership doubled down on the program, convinced that the West had merely postponed its plans for a decapitation strike. New directives were issued in early 1984, expanding the list of nuclear indicators that KGB residentūras were required to track. These included absurdly specific instructions, such as recording the number of ambulances parked outside American hospitals, monitoring civilian flight schedules, counting military trains, and even tracking the mood changes of senior Western officials, as shown on television. The operation's logic became circular. Agents were told to look for signs of nuclear war, and because they were certain war was coming, anything they saw could be interpreted as a sign. This ideological feedback loop slowly divorced Operation Ryan from reality. Soviet analysts, overwhelmed by the constant flow of data, began selectively interpreting reports to confirm their pre-existing fears. When Western militaries conducted exercises, the KGB claimed they were rehearsing for war. When militaries didn't conduct exercises, the KGB claimed they were attempting to conceal war preparations. Even Western arms control proposals, designed to reduce the risk of nuclear conflict, were interpreted as tricks meant to lull the USSR into a false sense of security before a surprise attack. And all the while, the Soviet Union was rotting from within. The economy was collapsing, the military was overextended, and the political leadership was aging. Andropov died in February 1984, followed by Konstantin Chernenko barely a year later. Each death deepened the Kremlin's sense of vulnerability. For a brief period, the fate of the world hinged on who would replace them. And then, unexpectedly, came a leader unlike any the USSR had seen in decades: Mikhail Gorbachev. Young, articulate, pragmatic, and curious about Western intentions, Gorbachev entered office in 1985 with a recognition that the Soviet Union could no longer sustain the endless tension of the Cold War. He questioned the foundations of Operation Ryan, not out of naivety, but because he understood that the program's underlying assumptions were actively endangering the Soviet state. For the first time in years, a Soviet leader was willing to consider the possibility that the United States did not actually intend to launch a nuclear attack. Gorbachev's inclinations were reinforced by internal studies quietly conducted by Soviet military analysts who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Operation Ryan's distortions. These studies revealed something astonishing. KGB residentūras were reporting nuclear warning signs not because they were observing meaningful intelligence, but because they were under immense pressure to prove the operation's relevance. Some reports were exaggerated, others were fabricated, and many were misinterpretations of ordinary events. Worse, the Soviet command structure, fearful of being unprepared for the worst-case scenario, treated even the most far-fetched pieces of intelligence as credible threats. Gorbachev recognized the danger immediately. A nuclear superpower operating on a hair trigger based on faulty intelligence was a catastrophe waiting to happen. And so, gradually, quietly, he began shifting the USSR away from Operation Ryan's apocalyptic worldview. But the program did not disappear overnight. Many within the military and intelligence services clung to it, especially hardliners who believed Reagan's America represented an existential threat. They distrusted Gorbachev's diplomatic overtures, claiming that the West would interpret them as weakness. And so the KGB continued gathering data for Operation Ryan, albeit with decreasing enthusiasm, even as its credibility eroded. Meanwhile, in Washington, Reagan underwent his own transformation. The intelligence that Oleg Gordievsky had provided, warning that the USSR genuinely believed the US might launch a nuclear strike, had shaken Reagan deeply. He began to question whether his Cold War rhetoric had unintentionally driven the world toward Armageddon. Privately, Reagan admitted he never realized how frightened the Soviets were. This insight became a turning point. Reagan initiated a diplomatic shift, reducing hostile rhetoric and seeking direct communication with Gorbachev. The result was a series of historic summits that de-escalated nuclear tensions and led to the elimination of entire categories of nuclear weapons. But behind the scenes, Operation Ryan still operated, albeit in a weakened state, quietly collecting data based on a worldview that was slowly becoming obsolete. Its final years were marked by declining interest from analysts, diminishing resources, and an increasing awareness that the entire program had been built on misinterpretation, fear, and ideological rigidity rather than meaningful intelligence. As Gorbachev pushed reforms like perestroika and glasnost, new information began flooding into Soviet society, information that contradicted the assumptions of Operation Ryan. Soviet citizens learned for the first time about economic failures, past nuclear accidents, environmental disasters, and political dysfunction. Even some KGB officers began questioning the moral and strategic logic of a program that had nearly pushed the world into nuclear war. By the late 1980s, Operation Ryan was effectively dying a quiet death. Analysts stopped treating its reports as credible. Political leaders stopped using it to guide policy. And within the KGB, a new generation of officers recognized that the program had become an embarrassing relic of Cold War paranoia. And yet, the legacy of Operation Ryan endured. Its influence shaped Soviet thinking throughout the 1980s, contributing to a climate of fear that magnified every misunderstanding between the superpowers. Its distortions nearly triggered a nuclear war during Able Archer 83. And perhaps most disturbingly, even as the program decayed, the psychological scars it left behind persisted. Within older Soviet leadership circles, distrust of the West remained deeply ingrained. Historians now widely agree that Operation Ryan represents one of the most dangerous intelligence failures in history. A failure not of technology or espionage skills, but of mindset. The program demonstrated how a nuclear superpower could intelligence its way into believing a war was coming, even when none of the signals pointed toward aggression. It showed how a system built on fear could interpret silence as threat, diplomacy as deception, and coincidence as conspiracy. And it revealed the terrifying fragility of nuclear peace when nations lack direct communication or mutual understanding. Even after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the archives of Operation Ryan revealed new insights. Researchers found cables, memos, and reports showing how deeply the program had penetrated Soviet strategic thinking. They found evidence that the KGB had monitored everything from London's Christmas lights to the US president's medical checkups, interpreting each detail as a potential sign of impending nuclear war. They found documentation of how analysts exaggerated normal NATO behavior until it resembled the plot of an apocalyptic thriller. Perhaps most chillingly, they found that Soviet leadership had occasionally discussed the possibility of launching a preemptive strike if Operation Ryan ever indicated certainty of a Western attack. Thankfully, certainty never came. But the fact that such discussions occurred at all underscores how close the world came to disaster. Looking back, many historians describe Operation Ryan as a tragic paradox. It was created to prevent a surprise nuclear attack, yet its flaw was that it assumed such an attack was inevitable. It aimed to provide clarity, yet it produced confusion. It sought to calm the Soviet leadership's fears, yet it amplified them. It was a program designed to protect the USSR, but ended up endangering the entire world. And to this day, Operation Ryan stands as a reminder that the most dangerous threat in a nuclear standoff may not be an enemy missile, but a government that convinces itself the missiles are already in the air. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the new Russian Federation inherited mountains of secret archives, boxes full of yellowing papers, coded telegrams, intelligence directives, and long-forgotten reports. Buried within those archives were the full records of Operation Ryan, revealing in stark clarity how the Soviet state had nearly talked itself into launching a nuclear war. Only after historians and intelligence experts began sifting through these documents did the world finally understand how close humanity came to destruction, and how the crisis of 1983 was not the result of American aggression, but of a Soviet intelligence system trapped inside its own echo chamber. What emerged from these files was a picture of a government that saw conspiracies everywhere, misinterpreted routine NATO behavior, and allowed ideological assumptions to override factual analysis. The documents revealed that Soviet agents in the West often invented or exaggerated signs of nuclear attack simply to meet reporting quotas. They showed that Moscow demanded constant evidence that the U.S. was preparing for war, and when no such evidence existed, analysts molded innocuous events into ominous warnings. There were memos describing mundane activities, a late-night meeting at the White House, increased security at an airport, unusual traffic on a military base, as indicators of imminent nuclear strike. There were frantic cables describing Christmas lights in London as potential blackout preparation. One report interpreted a rise in blood donations in West Berlin as preparation for mass casualties from a nuclear conflict. Another claimed that the appearance of women's hosiery shortages in New York could signal resource redistribution before war. These interpretations were not satire. They were official intelligence reports guiding the thinking of one of the world's two nuclear superpowers. Operation Ryan had not simply distorted Soviet perception. It had created an entirely fictional universe where the United States was on the verge of launching a surprise attack at any moment, and where every shift in Western behavior confirmed that belief. Yet the most haunting elements of the archive were the internal discussions among Soviet military leadership. Some generals genuinely believed the United States might attack without warning. Others argued that if NATO ever initiated a full-scale exercise or communications blackout, the USSR should consider a preemptive strike to avoid being destroyed. In a chilling phrase found in a 1984 Politburo memo, one advisor stated that waiting to absorb a first strike is national suicide. The Soviet Union had created a world in which nuclear war seemed inevitable, not because the United States was preparing one, but because Soviet intelligence had convinced itself it was. It was only after the Cold War that Western leaders fully grasped the gravity of the situation. Reagan, in his memoirs, wrote that he was stunned to learn how frightened the USSR had been and how narrowly the two superpowers had avoided catastrophe. Senior NATO commanders admitted they had been entirely unaware that the Soviets were interpreting routine exercises as preparations for war. MI6 and the CIA acknowledged that without the warning from Oleg Gordievsky, the West might never have realized the dangerous misperceptions growing inside the Kremlin. The crisis of 1983 became a turning point, not because the world recognized the danger at the time, but because leaders on both sides learned after the fact just how close they had come to being annihilated by misunderstanding. It was a lesson written in silence, discovered only in hindsight, but powerful enough to influence nuclear policy for decades. For Russia, the legacy of Operation Ryan became a cautionary tale about the dangers of intelligence overreach and the perils of politicizing national security. For the United States, it highlighted the importance of communication, transparency, and recognizing how one's actions might be interpreted through an adversary's lens. For historians, it demonstrated that the most dangerous moments of the Cold War were not always the public crises like Berlin or Cuba, but the hidden ones, moments known only to a handful of people, moments that never made the news, moments in which the world unknowingly walked on the edge of extinction. For the rest of us, Operation Ryan leaves behind a sobering truth. Nuclear war may not begin with an act of aggression, but with a misunderstanding. It may not start with missiles flying, but with intelligence officers misreading shadows. It may not be caused by hatred, but by fear. And it may not be prevented by weapons, but by wisdom. The operation stands today as a stark reminder that paranoia, once embedded into a nation's intelligence apparatus, can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Soviets believed the United States was preparing a decapitation strike, so they interpreted every indicator through that lens. And in doing so, they created a situation where one glitch in a satellite system or one misinterpreted military exercise could have started a nuclear exchange. Stanislav Petrov's decision to ignore the false alarm remains one of the most important acts of individual judgment in human history. His refusal to blindly trust a flawed system prevented the USSR from responding to a phantom attack with real missiles. In many ways, he stands as the quiet hero of Operation Ryan, a single man who, in the middle of a broken machine fueled by fear, chose reason over panic. In the end, the story of Operation Ryan is not merely a story of espionage or intelligence failure. It is a story of how nations can trap themselves inside narratives of fear, how leaders can be blinded by ideology, and how even the most powerful states can be destabilized by their own assumptions. It is the story of how the human mind, not nuclear weapons, was the greatest danger of the Cold War. And it is a warning for the future. Today, the world once again faces rising tensions, nuclear modernization, and mutual suspicion between major powers. Operation Ryan reminds us that the greatest risks may not come from deliberate aggression, but from miscalculations, miscommunications, and the invisible machinery of intelligence systems that filter our understanding of the world. As long as nuclear weapons exist, the danger of misperception remains. But the lessons of Operation Ryan, lessons written in secret cables, false alarms, and near-catastrophic misunderstandings, offer a path toward preventing future disasters. They remind us to question assumptions, to establish direct communication, and to see adversaries not as caricatures of evil, but as nations whose fears can be as dangerous as their weapons. And they remind us that sometimes the fate of the world hangs not on armies or governments, but on a single person making the right decision in a moment of unprecedented pressure. Today, historians, researchers, and intelligence analysts continue to study Operation Ryan, not because it was a triumph of espionage, but because it was one of the most perilous failures ever recorded. Proof that paranoia can be as destructive as any bomb. Its legacy endures in nuclear policy, diplomatic communication, and the quiet acknowledgement that humanity survived 1983 by chance, intuition, and the bravery of those who chose to think instead of fear. And so, the story of Operation Ryan closes not with an explosion, but with a whisper, a reminder that the world came close to ending without a single missile being launched. A reminder that peace is fragile and misunderstanding is deadly. A reminder that the Cold War's most dangerous moment was one the world never saw, driven by an operation that sought to protect the Soviet Union, but nearly destroyed the world instead.